So on January 28th, it was Data Privacy Day. And I can hear you more cynical ones out there laughing from here. But back in November of last year, on the 26th, the EU Council basically approved a regulation that was called chat control. We did a video about it when it actually came out. But essentially, if I was going to wrap it up real quick, it would just say that it's an Orwellian nightmare, essentially. And it would basically require that messaging apps scan your private communications and essentially force you to verify your identity with the government ID, just to do very basic things like send emails and whatnot. But anyways, the lie that they actually tried to shill at that time was that it was for child safety, and that tends to be kind of the default that they always go to. And the people who actually voted for that and told their citizens that it was necessary for that protection didn't really believe that, which obviously is not a shock to anyone. But they ended up, those exact same officials, the same people that people call officials or authorities, those same people ended up exempting themselves from that surveillance that they said was so necessary. So people like police officers, soldiers, intelligence officers, and the actual politicians, of course, who passed it, they all exempted themselves. They get to keep their private communications private, and you don't. And people might say that that's reasonable, that government officials need things like operational security exemptions for legitimate reasons. But the actual issue with that argument is that if the scanning algorithms are safe and effective, then why would operational security require any type of exemption, right? Like, their own exemption proves that they know exactly how dangerous and unreliable this technology is. And it is very much that way. The Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office, for example, which they call the BKA, reported that in 2024, out of 205,728 reports generated by these scanning systems, 99,375 were actually criminally irrelevant. So that's like 48%, maybe for a little bit more than that, but whatever, it's about 48%. That's the error rate. It's like half. That's nearly 100,000 innocent people who basically had all their stuff, their content, their messages, whatever, flagged and forwarded to these cops for no real reason. And the officials, quote unquote, who voted for this, they understand this. They know these numbers. They don't care. Right? And the thing that they do care about is making sure that they don't actually have to deal with stuff like those kind of false accusations. And I can guarantee you that there'll be some prosecution where they actually cite where, like, one of these people had their stuff, he had to have his stuff forwarded for second monitoring or whatever they want to call it. And they'll use that as a even though there's nothing in it. That's how it works. But here in the U.S., we have things like that too. They're not as obvious or really broadcast as much, but the CIA director, who's John Ratcliffe, ended up testifying under oath at a Senate Intelligence Committee back in March of last year, I think it was, specifically about Signal and how it's installed by default on the devices of most of the CIA officers, and that its usage is covered in their standard onboarding training. Now, his exact words were, quote, "One of the first things that happened when I was confirmed as a CIA director was Signal was loaded onto my computer at the CIA, as it is for most officers." Now, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also known as CISA, published guidance calling encrypted messaging apps like Signal a best practice for people like government employees. The people who run the surveillance state then, by default, use encrypted messaging to protect themselves from surveillance. So they know exactly how dangerous it is to have your communications monitored constantly. So they know it, and they just act like no one else should actually have it. So the next time that someone actually tells you that wanting privacy is suspicious, that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, then ask them, why is it that the CIA uses Signal? Ask them why EU officials, for example, exempt themselves from things like chat control. The nothing to hide argument carries no weight. It has always been nonsense that is fairly easily debunked when you actually think about it, or you look at the people who archetype that kind of ideology in general. But now we have stuff like sworn congressional testimony and leaked EU documents that prove that the people making that argument the most don't even believe it themselves. Anyways, they call it Data Privacy Day because back in like the 80s, early 80s, I think, on that date, the Council on Europe basically signed a convention, and it was Convention 108. It was the first international treaty that was specifically designed to protect personal data. Now, the U.S. officially recognized back in January 28th in 2009 when the House passed a resolution 402-0, and the Senate basically followed unanimously. And that's how long ago privacy used to be a bipartisan value, which really, really shows how far we've actually fallen since then, which is incredibly sad. A lot of my videos are fairly depressing because I talk about reality. It tends to be really depressing if you understand it. But I don't want this one to be all depressing and doom and gloom, basically, because there are actually some wins that are happening, and those are worth knowing about, right? Like, those are some of the wins are the things that can keep you going in some of these instances. 19 states have comprehensive privacy laws that are on the books. For example, California launched a system called Delete, where you can tell data brokers to delete your information from one place instead of having to hunt down each one individually and send them an email or call them or write a letter and have it be sent so that they have to sign for it or something. Like, it's just, it's an incredible pain if you've ever actually done that, to have to go through the entire process. And I have it, and it's like at the end of the process, 6 months later, it's back up. It's just it's infuriating. But there's a thing called global privacy control. And it's basically a browser setting that tells websites not to sell your data. And it's now mandatory in California, Colorado, Connecticut, and Oregon. It's something that absolutely should exist everywhere, in my opinion. Especially, if you're an American, you should be able to have that. Now, the FTC has actually also, to their credit, been going after data brokers, probably at the behest of the person doing a lot of their intelligence gathering and providing, which is Palantir, because those data brokers are probably kind of competition for them. Or who knows? Maybe they're partners, or subsidiaries. Anything's possible. The FTC actually banned Mobilewalla from selling location data after the company got caught tracking people's visits to healthcare facilities and places of worship, and then selling that to essentially anyone who would pay for it. And the same thing happened with Gravy Analytics and Ventrell. And the GM and OnStar settlements recently got finalized in January, banning them from sharing your location and driving behavior with data brokers for 5 years. Now, keep in mind, that doesn't mean they're not collecting it. They just can't share it for the next 5 years. Disney was another one who ended up paying $10 million for doing things like collecting kids' data illegally. It's essentially pocket change for them. Consider what kind of hardcore creep you actually have to be to participate in something like the illegal gathering of children's information. It's kind of insane. It's not like they work for Santa Claus or something. There's no nobility in what they're actually doing, which is sad and pathetic and, like you said, kind of creepy. And then, just this week, we also saw that Google agreed to pay $68 million in settlement costs because their voice assistants were recording people without proper activation. They were doing it automatically. So, speaking of which, if you actually use something like Gboard or something along those lines, you might want to consider looking at like Fudo Keyboard and, just them in general. They kind of have some really amazing products. But Signal basically had its biggest U.S. growth ever after you had the whole thing with the Trump administration and Signalgate, which is a scandal that happened back in March. Downloads ended up jumping 26% the day the news broke, and the app hit number 1 in the App Store across Finland, Belgium, Italy, and the Netherlands. Between 70 and 100 million people now use it monthly. And again, like CIA employees use it by default. So when the surveillance state's own employees are protecting themselves from surveillance, you really should take the hint and do it yourself if you're not already doing it. If you're watching this channel, you probably are. So congratulations on being one of those people and actually having some privacy. Now, none of this is to say, by the way, that Signal is by any means perfect, because it's not. In fact, I even did a video on this previously where I pointed out one of the employees that they had hired who was just like this kind of really anti-privacy dude who would go in and just kind of, help destroy privacy in various companies. And I have a whole video on that. I'm not going to get into it here, but Maryland also banned the sale of location and health data just completely outright. They're like, they're not allowed to do any of that there anymore. And New York's Senate also passed legislation to prohibit police from using biometric surveillance, including facial recognition, which is a massive win. There were also really brutal losses that we've seen along the way. And, for this video, I wanted to point out the wins because it's important to recognize those too. And that's, there are more, but, those are the major ones. And I kind of wanted to circle back to the whole EU thing, right? Because what they did really needs to be understood. It wasn't just that they passed some, simple surveillance law. Like, they actually built an Orwellian framework where the word voluntary means mandatory. It's a total rewrite of the English language. Like, it's complete newspeak if you understand the term correctly. Basically, providers have to do what they call this risk assessment, right? And they do this risk assessment, and they have all their services get classified as high risk if they don't scan messages. And the mandatory mitigation measures that they have for high-risk services, or people who are not going to bend the knee, basically, include implementing, quote-unquote, voluntary scanning. So you're not required to volunteer, but your required mitigation measures include volunteering. So it's like, if that's confusing, then I think that's kind of the point. Now, Patrick Breimer, who's the former MEP who was fighting this for years, called it chat control being privatized but not dead. Now, on top of that, we also see things like mandatory age verification for essentially everyone to use things like email, messaging apps, anything with chat functions in Europe. You'll have to upload a government ID or submit to some kind of facial recognition, and that's the end of anonymous communications. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is the body that's supposed to provide some type of independent oversight of surveillance, which, by the way, it's not. It's just it's a rubber stamp committee, essentially. But they're gone now. They got gutted when the administration actually terminated all 3 of the Democratic members, which left no quorum, basically. And that basically means that it's gone. Even the government trying to act like you're not being spied on. Even the fake bureaucracies are being absorbed kind of back into the Borg. And the UK is installing permanent facial recognition cameras in London, upcoming this summer. And, you'd think they would put them on the beaches or shorelines because they're being invaded constantly. But, it's like that old saying about barbed wire being used to keep the animals in and not necessarily the wolves out. Their independent reviewer of state threats legislation warned back in December that developers of encrypted and encryption technology could be detained and have their devices seized under national security laws, which lets you know who they consider to be the real threats. The U.S. still has no federal privacy laws after years of failed attempts, and it actually, indicts people who build privacy tools, like the Samurai devs, for example. But it means that our rights depend entirely on kind of whatever state you live in. And when I say rights, I mean like our privacy rights. But that said, they have 18 million other laws that exist that they can use to incarcerate you for virtually anything, including phone calls for 10 years under conspiracy charges. So it's just wild that all these laws, not one of them benefits your privacy. So where does that leave us? The people who actually pass these Orwellian surveillance laws don't actually want to be targeted by them. They don't want to be surveilled. And again, that tells you everything that you actually need to know about what privacy actually means and who they think deserves it. And it's not you, right? They're not trying to protect you or me. They're trying to protect themselves from us because most of them are far more evil and parasitic than any of us could ever be. But again, there are real wins that exist that are happening, and states are passing laws. Courts are ruling against mass surveillance in some cases. Then we're also seeing them rule against it in other cases. So it's kind of like this mixed bag of things that are actually and signal seeing record adoption. And I do like it, but I also think it has issues. And I think us calling out those issues, hopefully us calling those things out causes other people to be aware of them and potentially allows the tool to make itself a better tool through changing those things if they're significant. But people using encryption in general over not using encryption is always a win in my book. Like, the fight isn't over. And every person who uses encrypted messaging or talks about privacy or operational security, those who enable things like the global privacy control, those who exercise their rights under the state regarding privacy laws, or, exercise their rights because they're free to do that. Currently, it makes it harder for the people who want to treat privacy like it's a criminal act to really do so. So if you want to do something today, for example, check what permissions you grant to your app. Do they actually need those permissions? Try doing this. Delete just one app from your phone that you can use. Like, you can go on, for example, you can download and install Brave, and then when you're on your phone, you can like, let's say it's Twitter or whatever, I don't know. Instead of having the X app, you go to X on the phone and you save it to your homepage. And now you still have the ability to hit it and boom, instantly be on X. But now a lot of the permissions are dead. It doesn't have as much reach into your phone, into your data. And it's a simple thing to do, and you still have the functionality that you would have with the app. If you have global privacy control in your browser, turn it on, right? Like, see if your state has a privacy law for it. If it doesn't, try to, argue for it. Use encrypted messaging. Do what the CIA does, minus, the executions and manipulations and betrayals and subversion of U.S. taxpayers and overthrow of countries, right? Like, most importantly, protect yourself, because no one's going to protect you. Like, they want you to lose hope. They want you to give up. They want you to stop trying to protect yourself. They want you to get tired, so you put your hands down, so you get hit. And screw that. Like, let that motivate you to go even harder, to do even more, to be even more ruthless. That's what they don't want. And that's one of the best ways that you can beat them on an individual level. Because it's a fight that can be something that we all do together, but it's also one that's waged on an individual basis. So stay safe, stay aware. There are adversaries out there, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching to the end.